I ruled this neighborhood, but would she surrender when I revealed my secret? Welcome to my story. Stay tuned for more dramatic showdowns. I never went looking for trouble, but when I found that bright orange notice stuck to my front door on Tuesday morning, I knew the fight had just begun. My hands tightened around the paper as I read the bold letters. Immediate fine, $500 per month. Violation, excessive vehicles on property. 3 cars, that's all this was about? My work truck, essential for my construction business. My wife's SUV for her hospital shifts. And the used sedan we had just bought as a birthday gift for our son's 16th. All of them parked neatly in our own driveway. Through the kitchen window, I spotted a woman pacing down the street, clipboard in hand. Her sharp gaze swept over every detail, hunting for any excuse to issue another fine. She stopped in front of my house, pulled out her phone, and started snapping pictures, again. This was the 3rd time this week. Jack, she's out there again. My wife, Emily, called from the living room. Maybe we should just move the sedan into the garage. No, I said firmly, pouring my coffee. We're not hiding our daughter's car like we're doing something wrong. The garage is full of Emily's medical supplies and my work equipment, just like we explained at the last meeting. At that meeting, I couldn't shake the memory of how smug she had looked when I tried to explain our situation. Rules are rules, Mr. Carter, she had said, barely glancing up from her phone. Maybe if you can't afford proper garage storage, this neighborhood isn't for you. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that for the past 5 years, I had been quietly buying up properties in this community through my real estate investment company. Every time a house went on the market, I made sure it was purchased under different LLC names. It started as a smart investment strategy, but now it had become something much bigger. I stepped outside to check the mail, taking my time on purpose. A few houses down, she pretended to inspect Mrs. Whitman's rose bushes, but I could feel her watching me out of the corner of her eye. Poor Mrs. Whitman. Last month, she had been fined for her roses being too vibrant and disrupting the so-called neighborhood color harmony. My phone buzzed. A text from my lawyer. Property closing complete. You now own 67% of the development. I smiled, tucking the phone into my pocket just as she power walked toward me. Her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. Mr. Carter, she called out, her voice dripping with fake politeness. I trust you received our notice about the vehicle violation? I did, Margaret, and I have a few questions about the legal basis for this sudden fee increase. I said evenly, keeping my tone professional. She waved a hand dismissively. The board has full authority to implement fees as necessary. Perhaps if you attended more meetings, you'd understand how these things work. Her smile was tight, forced. What she didn't realize was that I had attended every single meeting for the past 5 years, through proxy representatives who owned the other houses I had bought. I had sat back and carefully documented every selective enforcement, every questionable fee, every abuse of power. And now the game was about to change. As she turned to leave, the sharp click of her designer heels echoed against the pavement. Without looking back, she called over her shoulder. Oh, and the board is holding an emergency meeting tonight. 7 p.m. sharp. We'll be discussing additional measures for problem properties. I watched her disappear down the street, then pulled out my phone and typed a quick message to my lawyer. Time to prepare those documents we discussed. Margaret is making her move tonight. At that moment, my daughter's car pulled into the driveway. I saw Margaret pause, pull out her phone, and snap more photos. My jaw clenched, but I forced myself to stay calm. Tonight would change everything. But first, I had work to do. Inside, I spread out the property maps on my desk, every lot carefully highlighted and coded. 5 years of planning, 5 years of gathering evidence, 5 years of watching Margaret's grip on this neighborhood tighten, her petty fines and power plays turning neighbors against each other. What she didn't realize was that her biggest mistake wasn't just targeting my family. It was underestimating exactly who she was dealing with. My phone rang. It was Mrs. Whitman, calling from across the street. Her voice shaky. Another violation notice. I listened as she explained. Barely hearing the words, I'd heard too many stories like hers before. My eyes flicked to the framed photo on my wall, my father, standing tall in front of his first home. The same home he was forced to sell at a loss 20 years ago. Driven out by Antan's endless harassment. Dad had taught me 2 things, play the long game, and fight smart. I checked my watch, 6 hours until the meeting. Margaret wanted to play hardball over a few cars in a driveway? She had no idea what was coming. When I walked into the community center that evening, the tension was thick. Every seat was filled, neighbors I'd known for years, whispering in hushed voices, glancing toward me as I entered. Margaret had really pulled out all the stops this time. She'd even hired a professional photographer to take pictures of my driveway from different angles, making 3 perfectly normal cars look like some kind of illegal parking operation. I took my seat, folded my hands, and smiled. "Let the games begin. Let's begin," Margaret announced, tapping her obnoxiously sparkly pink gavel against the podium. She had deliberately scheduled this emergency meeting for a Tuesday evening, knowing full well that most working families would struggle to attend. But I was here, sitting quietly in the back row, watching as she put on her usual performance. "As you can see from these professional photographs," she began, clicking through her PowerPoint slides, "Mr. Carter's property has essentially turned into a used car lot." A few dramatic gasps came from the front row loyalists, the same people whose Christmas decorations stayed up until March without ever receiving a fine. I let my gaze drift around the room, noting the reactions. Mrs. Rodriguez, my elderly neighbor, rolled her eyes. She'd been fined last month because her grandson had parked in her driveway while helping her fix her leaking roof. Mr. Chen, the high school science teacher, was furiously scribbling notes, no doubt remembering the violation he'd received for parking half an inch over his own driveway line during the last snowstorm. Margaret clicked to the next slide, zooming in on my daughter's car. "This vehicle has been parked in the same spot for over 48 hours. She declared, her tone smug. She conveniently left out the part where my daughter had been home from college for the weekend. The meeting dragged on as she paraded her so-called evidence charts showing questionable property value decreases, anonymous complaints, almost certainly from her inner circle, and even a weather report claiming that my cars were somehow contributing to excess snowdrifts on the street. And then she took it a step further. Furthermore, she continued, pulling out a thick binder, "I've documented every instance of vehicles entering and leaving Mr. Carter's property over the past 3 months." My eyebrows shot up. She had been tracking my family's movements. A ripple of discomfort spread through the room. Several neighbors shifted uneasily in their seats. For the first time that night, Margaret's grip on the room started to slip. That's when Sarah Jenkins, my next-door neighbor, stood up. "Karen, isn't this a bit excessive? We're talking about normal cars in a normal driveway." Margaret's face flushed red. "You're out of order. You haven't been recognized by the chair." I watched as her husband, Bob, began passing out copies of a newly proposed bylaw, one that would limit each household to 2 vehicles and require garage parking only. The sheer absurdity of it almost made me laugh. "Almost. We'll now vote on the new vehicle restrictions and fee increase," Margaret announced, skipping any chance for discussion. "All in favor?" That was my cue. I stood up slowly, adjusting my tie. "Point of order, Madam President." Margaret's gaze sharpened as she peered at me over her reading glasses. "You are not recognized, Mr. Carter." "Actually," I said, pulling out a folder, "according to bylaw section 7.3, any property owner may raise a point of order regarding voting procedures." The room fell silent. I caught the way Margaret's manicured nails tightened around the podium. "Before we vote, I believe it's important to review the current ownership structure of this community." I took a step forward, the click of my shoes against the linoleum floor echoing in the stillness. Over the past 5 years, Sunrise Properties has been acquiring homes in this development. Margaret's face visibly paled as I pulled out a large property map, unfolding it with deliberate precision. "And as CEO of Sunrise Properties, I thought it might interest everyone to know exactly who owns the majority of this neighborhood." I paused, scanning the faces of the board members, each one realizing the weight of what I was saying. "But perhaps we should first discuss something else, specifically, the surveillance activities you've been conducting on residents." The room erupted in murmurs. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw phones being raised, neighbors recording every second of the unfolding spectacle. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached for her water bottle, knocking over her precious pink gavel in the process. Then, Bob rushed to the podium, whispering urgently in her ear. Her eyes widened. For the first time, she fully grasped exactly who she had been messing with. The meeting room fell silent. My heart pounded, but my voice remained steady. Margaret's smug smile was gone. I unlatched my leather briefcase, pulling out a thick stack of property deeds. "Before we vote on these new fees," I said, "I have something important to share with everyone." I laid the papers down on the table, one by one. Each document was another piece of my plan, one that had been years in the making. The room buzzed with whispers as I neatly arranged them in rows. "For the past 5 years," I continued, "I've watched this board ignore serious maintenance issues while harassing good neighbors over petty nonsense." I let my words settle before glancing toward the front row. I've seen Margaret here write up Mrs. Whitman, who's 82 years old, for having a flower pot that was an inch too tall. Meanwhile, her friend Susan's bright purple fence never got so much as a warning. The weight of my words hung in the air. Margaret knew. The entire room knew. Her reign was about to end. Margaret's face turned a deep shade of red. That's not true. I enforce all rules fairly, she snapped, reaching for her water bottle. Her hand trembled so badly that water sloshed onto her expensive designer blouse. I clicked the remote, and the meeting room's big screen lit up. Here's Margaret measuring my grass at 3 a.m. last Tuesday, I said smoothly. The security footage was crystal clear. There she was, crouched in my yard with a flashlight and a ruler. Several people gasped. I clicked to the next slide. And here she is completely ignoring the Petersons' violations. Right after they hired her son's landscaping company. A wave of murmurs swept the room. I saw people starting to nod, remembering their own run-ins with her selective enforcement. I let the moment hang before picking up the stack of deeds in front of me. But the most interesting thing I discovered. I paused, watching her shift uncomfortably. Is that through my company, Sunrise Properties? I now own 67% of the homes in this development. The silence was deafening. Then, I dropped the bombshell. That makes me the majority owner of this entire association. Margaret shot up from her chair, knocking it over. You can't do that. It's not allowed, she shrieked, her voice suddenly high-pitched with panic. I leaned back, completely calm. Actually, I can. I slid another folder onto the table. I've had 3 separate law firms review everything. It's all perfectly legal. I pulled out a second folder, even thicker than the first. I also have signed complaints from 32 residents detailing harassment, selective enforcement, and suspicious fees. The room erupted. Mrs. Whitman, the sweet 82-year-old from across the street, stood up, her voice shaking. Last winter, they fined me $200 for not shoveling my walkway fast enough. I was in the hospital with pneumonia. Others joined in, voices rising with outrage. Margaret banged her ridiculous pink gavel, trying to restore order, but no one was listening to her anymore. I raised my hand slightly, and the room quieted just enough. I moved to dissolve the current board. I announced, we'll hold new elections, with term limits, transparency, and clear rules about conflicts of interest. No more 3 a.m. grass measuring. No more selective enforcement. Bob Chen from 2 doors down shot his hand into the air. I second that motion. A ripple swept through the room as hands went up, one after another. Margaret grabbed her designer purse and stormed toward the door. This meeting is adjourned, she shrieked. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. I didn't even blink. Actually, I said, voice still smooth, according to Section 7.3 of the bylaws. You need a majority vote to adjourn, and I don't think you have that anymore. I gestured toward the deeds spread across the table. We're just getting started. She froze, her hand gripping the doorknob. For the first time, she understood. 20 years of ruling this neighborhood with an iron fist, gone. I flipped open another folder. Now, let's talk about those mysterious pool renovation fees from last summer, the ones where $50 disappeared. Yet the pool never got fixed. Margaret stumbled back, her face pale. She hadn't noticed yet, but outside, a local news van had just pulled into the parking lot. I had personally invited them to cover our community reorganization meeting. And Margaret? She was tonight's headline. The next few hours would change our neighborhood forever, but first, we had years of Margaret's corruption to uncover. And I had every single receipt. For 5 years, I had been playing the long game. Now, it was all paying off. And the best part? That was still to come. Monday morning, I walked into my lawyer's office to find 20 furious voicemails from Margaret. Over the weekend, she had finally discovered my company's property records, and she was livid. She threatened to sue me, accused me of secretly trying to take over the neighborhood, and ranted about how I had manipulated the system. I couldn't help but smirk. She had finally shown her true colors. But Margaret wasn't just angry, she was scared. That evening, she went door to door, spewing desperate rumors that I was planning to pave over the neighborhood and turn it into a parking lot for my personal car collection. Some neighbors actually believed her, especially when she waved around fake documents, claiming I had ties to a shady development company. I knew I had to act fast. That night, my security cameras caught Margaret sneaking onto my property at midnight, taking close-up photos of my car's license plates. By the next morning, she had filed a lawsuit. She accused me of violating housing rules by purchasing properties through my company. She even tried to secure an emergency court order to freeze my voting rights. Big mistake, because this was exactly the moment I had been preparing for. My lawyer was ready. We unveiled our secret weapon, a detailed record of every town meeting for the past 5 years. The judge's eyes widened as we laid out the evidence. Video footage of Margaret letting her friends off the hook while harshly fining others. Bank records showing she had used town funds to renovate her own backyard. Emails where she bragged about using her position to keep undesirable elements out of the neighborhood. Margaret turned pale. The courtroom went silent as we played a time-stamped video of her measuring my grass with a ruler at 3 a.m., taking photos of my teenage daughter's car, leaving threatening notes on neighbors' doors. Her lawyer started sweating when we showed proof that she had altered TAN records to erase her friend's unpaid dues. But the real shock came next. 3 former board members stood up. One by one, they testified how Margaret bullied them into approving unfair rules, how she personally targeted homeowners she didn't like, how she bragged about using TAN fines to pay for her yearly trips to Hawaii. The final nail in the coffin? We pulled up Margaret's own social media posts. The screen flickered with an image of her, lounging poolside in Maui. Sunglasses on, drink in hand. And the caption? "Thanks to all my rule-breaking neighbors for funding this vacation. Keep those violations coming." The room fell into stunned silence. Margaret slumped in her seat, face drained of color. She had spent years running this neighborhood like a dictator. Now, her entire empire was crumbling before her eyes. And I was just getting started. Margaret tried to defend herself, insisting she was just doing her job. But then we played the recording from last month's TAN meeting, where she had screamed at Mrs. Whitman, our 75-year-old neighbor, for having a bird feeder 2 inches too low. That's when she finally snapped. Margaret jumped to her feet, finger shaking as she pointed at me. "He's trying to destroy our perfect neighborhood," she shrieked. Her voice cracked as she looked around the room, searching for support. "Do you even realize what kind of people will move in if we don't enforce strict rules? He probably wants to turn this place into one of those communities where people can park wherever they want." The judge had heard enough. Not only did he dismiss her lawsuit, but he also ordered a full audit of the TAN's finances. As we stepped out of the courthouse, my phone buzzed non-stop. Margaret had sent a mass email. She was resigning immediately, claiming she was being forced out by big money interests. I glanced up just in time to see her storm to her car, already furiously typing on her phone. I knew this wasn't over. She still had loyal followers, and she wasn't the type to admit defeat. But I had what I needed: proof that she had been abusing her power for years. The legal authority to make real, lasting changes. The final battle. The morning of the final court hearing started with a surprise. Margaret had sent an army of news vans to my house. She thought public pressure would make me back down. Instead, she had just given me the perfect stage. I straightened my tie, grabbed my documents, and walked right up to the reporters with a smile. "Good morning, everyone. I'm James Carter, and I'd love to show you something interesting about our TAN's financial records." I pulled out the color-coded spreadsheets my accountant had prepared. The reporters' eyes widened as I showed them. Suspicious fees that always seemed to benefit Margaret's closest friends. How single parents were fined at higher rates than her golf buddies. Security footage of Margaret measuring my grass at 3 a.m., while her own yard broke every rule in the book. Inside the courthouse, Margaret sat with her expensive lawyer, wearing her signature fake pearl necklace and a smug smile. That smile vanished the moment our lawyer began presenting evidence. We showed photos of Margaret's own house breaking multiple TAN rules. Her secret Facebook group, where she bragged about targeting specific families. A post where she wrote, "Let's see how long the Carters last with these new fees. Maybe they'll finally move and sell to someone more suitable." Margaret jumped up to object, but froze mid-sentence when we played the recording from last week's pool party. Her voice rang clear through the courtroom. "Of course I make up violations. How else can we control who lives here?" The judge's gavel came down hard. Margaret was permanently removed from the TAN board. She was ordered to pay back every unfair fee she had collected. When she heard the total, $14,789.20, her face turned ghost white. That moment, better than any revenge I could have planned. Building something better. With my majority ownership, we rebuilt the TAN from the ground up. We elected 5 new board members, real residents who actually cared about the community. Mrs. Rodriguez, whom Margaret had tried to fine for cooking ethnic food. Mr. Chen, whose beautiful garden she called too exotic. The changes came fast. Kids could now play basketball in their driveways. Gardens could grow vegetables, not just flowers. Families could park more than 2 cars, as long as they fit in their own space. 3 weeks later, I watched through my window as Margaret's moving truck pulled up. She had sent one final letter, claiming she was moving to a better neighborhood with higher standards. Nobody missed the parking ticket stuck to her windshield as she drove away. That evening, my daughter parked her car right next to my work truck and my wife's SUV. I walked outside and hammered in a small wooden sign, one we had all voted on together. "Welcome to Carter Hills, where good neighbors make great communities." A final twist. The next morning, I got an unexpected call. A TV producer had seen the news coverage. He wanted to make a documentary about how we transformed our town. I looked out my window. Kids were playing in their yards. Neighbors were chatting over fences. Somewhere out there, Margaret was watching this unfold from her new house. A house that had a strict one-car garage rule. The best part? Our property values skyrocketed, up 15% in the first month after she left. Turns out, people prefer living in a neighborhood where they're treated with respect, rather than ruled by fear. The legacy we left behind. Some of Margaret's old allies eventually came around. They stopped by, apologized, admitted they had only gone along with her out of fear. We still hadn't tan, but this time, it actually protected the neighborhood instead of policing it. Every month, we used fees for real improvements, not power trips. We fixed the playground. We repaired the pool. We helped elderly residents maintain their homes. We even turned the spot where Margaret used to take yard violation photos into a community garden. One afternoon, as I filed away the last court document, my phone buzzed. A text message from Margaret's new neighborhood. They had their own power-hungry tan president now, and they were asking for advice. I leaned back in my chair, chuckling to myself, because sometimes, the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's teaching others how to stand up for themselves.